Welcome to our webinar, Navigating ESSER III Funding for Education Technology. Thanks for joining us. As everyone is still getting signed in, we'll just go over a few housekeeping items. Please think of questions throughout the webinar and direct them to the Q&A section. We'll be answering them throughout and at the end of the webinar. This webinar will be recorded, and we'll share the recording with you shortly after it's finished. If we don't get to all of your questions, we'll follow up with you afterward. Reaching out to info@jamf.com will also get you in contact with someone at Jamf quickly. My name is Mike Lawrence, and I'm proud to be an education leadership executive here at Jamf. With 30 years in education, with nearly 20 of those as an Apple Distinguished Educator, I have supported many schools in their use of technology, often advocating at state capitals, on Capitol Hill, and in the White House for educational funding, clear ed tech policy, and in support of the work that you do every day. I'll be joined a little later by Stephen Langford. He's the Chief Information Officer for the Beaverton School District, serving 40,000 students and their families. Steve has served in technology leadership roles over the past 32 years, both in K-12 and higher education institutions. He's the past chair of the Consortium for School Networking, COSN, Board of Directors, and also serves on the Board of Directors for the Association for Computer Professionals in Education, which is COSN's state chapter for Oregon and Washington. At Jamf, our mission is to empower student success. We bridge the gap between what Apple creates and what education requires. We've been helping organizations succeed with Apple for more than 20 years. Today, Jamf helps more than 72,000 customers manage and secure more than 30 million Apple devices. We've seen Apple adoption take off over the last few years, and we've seen education transformed by Apple. And we're the only company in the world that provides complete management security for an Apple-first environment. Our ability to manage, secure, and extend the Apple experience with deep integrations with Microsoft, Google, and other education solutions to deliver a complete experience in education, opening up new learning and teaching opportunities. One other major benefit of choosing Jamf for our exclusive focus on Apple is our history of and commitment to something we call same-day support. Same-day support means less work for you, faster access to new Apple features for your end users, and better control for your admins. For 11 years running, Jamf has delivered support for Apple operating systems, macOS, iPadOS, iOS, and tvOS the day they are released. If your educators or student users are craving that hot new feature from Apple, it is easy to kick off a mass operating system upgrade across your entire fleet, or delay it for a few months if that's the decision you'd like to make. The pandemic saw a huge increase in government funding across the globe, with technology being the key solution to connect students with their teachers and maintain some form of education when students were out of the school buildings, when the school buildings were closed. Educators quickly had to adopt new approaches, and schools had to look at their technology available to enable student access. Where schools had a more developed program, this transition was easier, but in schools that hadn't begun to build these digital strategies, the transition was more complex. Government support meant that schools were provided more devices that could be used at home, connecting students with their teachers, but in many cases, this was not a permanent solution. And in fact, many of those initial devices are getting close to the point of needing a refresh. IT typically looks at a 3 to 5 year cycle for this due to upgrades to technology and the need to maintain device security. So how does this impact a school's refresh plan, especially as we see the increased need for digital literacy? We'll discuss this with Stephen a little later. Planning for a continual refresh is essential. If a curriculum or school approach to learning and teaching has technology as a part of the overall strategy, then what does that deployment look like in the future as these devices get outdated? Will the education of students that start today be different to those that start in 3 or 5 years? Will their devices still be able to offer the access required? To put it another way, would you use the same pens in 3 years' time, or would you have a plan to replace them? It may be more expensive to replace the technology, but the point is the same. So making sure that there is a plan in place for that next spend is critical to the success of any initial vision. Where government funding may have been used, what was the level of that funding? How might you match that over time? Some of this can be achieved by trading in those devices to recover some of their residual value. meaning that those devices can start to have an impact on the cost of a replacement. It's important to note here that this is where the total cost of purchase discussion is important when considering device purchase. When some devices may be cheaper in that initial purchase, but they hold less residual value, whereas higher value initial purchase also comes with a higher residual value, making the overall cost actually less. This is the case in iPad and Chromebooks, and is a useful factor when considering which tools to purchase in the first place. It's also important to understand and explore the funding streams available to you in your region. Is there a digital fund? Can digital tools be purchased under different funding streams where tools meet the outcomes of the funding, for example? Or access for less privileged? Attainment improvement funding for specific subjects where you can justify the tool is used to impact that outcome? Funding can pay for the device. In my conversation with Stephen, you'll hear us discuss several sources of funding, including COVID relief funds like ESSER III, which, it should be noted, must be obligated to spend by September 30th, 2024, although grant activities carried out through a valid obligation of those funds may continue beyond that date. We'll also talk about other long-standing programs like E-Rate, and we'll look at two new initiatives, one that recently passed Congress, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and the newly proposed FCC funding for cybersecurity within the Learn Without Limits program. As we look at this centralized funding, it's important to explore these efficiency savings as you look to stretch that budget you already have, and perhaps, as Stephen later says, offset your general fund. We hope to help you find savings that ultimately help you fund your technology deployments. One key document that touches on most of these funding sources is the Dear Colleague letter issued by the Department of Education's Office of Ed Tech in January of this year. I recently spoke with Ji Soo Song, Digital Equity Advisor from that office, and he encouraged me to make this resource available to all of you during today's webinar. It offers important recommendations, guidance, and suggestions on funding sources and their appropriate uses. One other thing to look at in more detail to help with school budgets is the wider impact of having technology in the classroom. This can be as simple as looking at those operational efficiencies that can impact spending in other areas, such as printing and photocopying. In many cases, use of technology can reduce this significantly, and with a really robust approach to a digital strategy can in fact start to pay for the devices itself. We've already seen this with paperless classrooms and offices and so forth. Incorporating the use of inline feedback, marking, communication, digital storage of work, etc. all means less need to print, photocopy, or even have exercise books for the students' work. That also means less of a need for pens and other equipment. Now, that might not be what every school wants to do, but looking at where you can save money will go a long way to keeping a digital strategy thriving. And then there is consolidation of your vendors. At Jamf, we offer both management and security, providing cost savings as we bundle together the offerings to support your deployment. This single vendor approach supports institutions for both simplicity of integration and cost saving. Whether you're using iPad only or a mix of Mac and iPad, as we focus on an Apple first, Apple best strategy, we ensure you're covered in both of those areas, with a clear focus on making those Apple devices work in the way you expect them to, as well as how your end users will expect them to work, based on their knowledge of Apple from the consumer space. These are essential elements to consider when choosing the systems that support your deployment. Thank you for coming, Stephen. So glad you're here.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Tell us a little bit about Beaverton School District. We were talking beforehand. You said we're a little unique, but I think it'd be great for the folks that are here to hear from you specifically about your district and how you approach it, funding education technology.
Sure. Beaverton School District is just outside of Portland, Oregon, in Beaverton. We serve about 40,000 students and their families. And so for us, I think when we think back to how learning shifted 3 years plus years ago now with the pandemic, we were very fortunate in that our community had invested in a bond that allowed us to digitally transform teaching and learning in our operations. And so when the pandemic happened, we entered already with big parts of our ecosystem in place in terms of devices and teacher training and LMS and everything you need to think about to visualize kind of how learning can happen online. So that I think is, we were in somewhat of a unique situation, not all by ourselves, but we were fortunate in that situation. And so that's a little bit of a snapshot of us.
Sure. And you and your community were thinking ahead, and that's to be applauded. So speaking about the past, when the pandemic hit and we had to suddenly shift to remote learning, you had those pieces in place to support your students' learning, but we also had federal funding roll in. And the way that it rolled in was in these waves with various acronyms. We generally refer to the most recent of those as ESSER funds. So can you speak to how your district used those funds in that circumstance and where you are today in terms of the last round, ESSER III?
Sure. And it was great because I think the school systems went into crisis at that moment. We were in a pandemic, everyone was locked at home. There's that trauma of not being able to go to school or work and living through the pandemic. And we were fortunate, school systems were, that the funding was released so that we could immediately make some changes. And for us, what I've said before is it kind of reset our reality about what's possible. And I think that happened a lot in education during that time. Like, a simple example of, we had to make VPN happen for 5,000 staff in 24 hours. Pre-pandemic, that would have never been on the table. We would have been thinking, let's build a plan, let's pilot the plan, and then maybe months and months out, we would have a functional VPN for staff. And we did it in 24 hours because we had to. And so that story is all over the country in every single school district. I'm sure people watching, you have similar stories. And so for us, we were fortunate that the funding kind of was made available so that we could make these sudden and drastic shifts. And what our most pressing need was, like many, it wasn't the devices so much, but it was connectivity. Even though we live in a city that has great connectivity, we had a number of students who just did not have adequate connectivity. And so a lot of our investment initially went to making sure students could get online with the device that they already had. And they're doing that in the context of one or two parents or two or more other students in the house, all sharing that internet connection. So that was most of our initial investment. And then as through the pandemic and we returned back to school, we started seeing that need for social emotional learning support. And so a lot of our ESSER funding then shifted away from things into people. And so for us, that's really been our story of, we've been looking at how best to support students where they were when they came back to us in terms of interventions and social emotional learning needs. And that was where the funding moved to at that point in time.
Yeah, I was very grateful that funding had that option in there. One of the documents that we're going to make available, and we will continually, I think, reference today, is the Dear Colleague letter that was put out by the Office of Ed Tech of the U.S. Department of Education. I reached out to some of my colleagues there and friends, and they said, oh, you should absolutely share this letter. It not only hits to what you just spoke to, the flexibility of some of the ESSER funds to cover not just hardware and technical connections, but also the individual learning needs that all students and faculty, for that matter, had to address. The sudden shift to remote, dealing with your own social and emotional well-being, and the fact that the funding allowed for support of that. Also in helping students catch up where they may have lost the opportunity to learn in certain windows, there's funding available for that as well. So I encourage our attendees to take a look at that document that is available at the Office of Ed Tech, of course, their website, but we'll make it available here as well. It also dives into some of the other funding sources that we'll be talking about. So that's great to hear, and I'm glad that you guys used the funding in that way. One of the things that I was thinking about too was in terms of when you rush into this sort of a circumstance, you want to use that funding wisely. You want to use that funding on devices that are going to last and be sustainable. How did your district approach that when choosing devices and making sure that you were, certainly moving swiftly, but not rushing recklessly to be responsible ultimately.
Yeah, and that's, it's they're almost competing kind of ideas at that moment. It's like do something really, really quick and really, really thoughtfully and well. And that's a challenge, and then you couple in, and do it as financially a responsible manner you can. So, it's you can have it fast, cheap, or well done, pick two. And that was kind of thrown out the window because we just had to do it. But what we did was, we have a pretty rigorous process that we began. Our journey with devices and one-to-one began probably 7 years ago now. And so we have a pretty rigorous process of testing devices with students, teachers, getting parent input, and then we have a whole IT benchmarking, torture testing, tear down, rebuild. We analyze the cost of parts for repairability so we can project out over the life of the device how much it will cost to repair. So all of that, thankfully, we had that data. So we were able to say, okay, based on that, we can make some decisions now. And so we were pretty fortunate at that moment, but that it does speak to, the taking the time to invest in a solid process for selecting devices so that even if you're rushed and you're in that pandemic mindset of we have to have this tomorrow, you have something to lean on other than what's available. And sadly, a lot of the conversations devolved into what was available because supply chain was destroyed at that moment.
Yeah, absolutely. The good news is that when we're looking at funding that remains, and about 2/3 of the ESSER III funds still remain unspent, we aren't in that same rushed situation. We can breathe a little bit more. Students are largely back in the school. So if you were talking to a district that had a lot of those funds available, what advice would you give in how to spend that funding? Because certainly we want to spend it appropriately and thoughtfully, but we don't want to leave much on the table. We want to make sure that that funding gets spent so that we can benefit our students that we serve. So what advice would you offer to a school district in that circumstance?
Yeah, for us, as I mentioned, we shifted once students were back, largely we shifted to the supports, and that meant people. And so the challenge for us is that those funds are going to expire and the people aren't going to expire. So we've got to figure out how to build a glide path to make sure that we're able to maintain the supports that students need. And so, but for those districts that are in that situation, that funding cliff that we all talked about as we were purchasing devices, that funding cliff time is now for us, for many of us. And so if funds are on the table, then this is the perfect time because it's going to be refresh time for everybody, I think, because we all bought devices in that 2021 time window. And so this would be a great way to be thinking about sustainability because so many districts across the country did heroic work with teachers and all staff, but particularly the IT staff's role was we have to build out a digital ecosystem environment for our students and our teachers to work and learn. And so that's an investment in software in terms of LMS, devices, connectivity, teacher training and support. And it would be a shame to see that collapse. We didn't have the time to think about sustainability in that moment, but now's the time for us to be able to say, well, this money on the table means a refresh so that we can start building ourselves that runway to get to sustainability.
Yeah, I thank you for mentioning professional development. I've been doing that most of my career. So I was pleased to see that the funding allows for that. And some of the other things you mentioned as well, software and making sure that you're securing your devices as well, especially when we sent them home. It was something that, again, we had to turn on like your VPN very quickly. But it's important to think long term in terms of, are we still protecting against the latest threats that are out there and the tools that the bad actors out there have to work against our schools and districts? So making sure that your cybersecurity is up to date. Just looking through the list of the document that we're going to share, you can also use the funds for resources, like you mentioned, communication tools for parents to make sure that the parents are kept up to date and they have the most recent. tools, supporting universal design principles, which really supports all students, honestly, but it came out of the supporting of students with disabilities. And so it's one worth mentioning and looking at there. I'm just scrolling through to see other things here as well, but there's a lot of flexibility in this funding, and it's again something that is hard to find when you're getting some federal funding. Usually it has very specific and narrow places within which you could spend it. So this is an opportunity that we really should not miss. So thank you for sharing those. Going back to cybersecurity for a moment, I wonder if we could switch gears. There was a bit of news recently. Our friends over at the FCC, Jessica Rosenworcel, who's the FCC chair, recently made some remarks saying that she'd be releasing a proposal and encouraging her fellow commissioners to vote for the expansion of the Learn Without Limits program. It's an initiative that launched recently, and she wants to make $200 million available to purchase cybersecurity software. Now, this is still in the early stages, but I thought I'd capture your thoughts on it while we have this moment together and what you might advise your colleagues in other schools and districts.
Yeah, that was such welcome news. And I know organizations like Shelby and COSIN and many others were in support of this, and certainly school districts around the country saw that as very welcome news and exciting news. The challenge for us is exactly what you mentioned. You know, we were focused on devices, focused on making sure learning happens, and you can't forget it has to happen in a secure environment. We have lots of student data that we have to protect and secure. We have bad actors who are trying to get into our systems for that data and for financial data that we have to protect against. That all falls in our realm of responsibility. And so it was really exciting to think about, you know, giving the ability for districts to leverage next gen firewalls and cybersecurity appliances. That's not just going to protect the districts, which is the most important thing, right? Is to protect that. But I think something that could get overlooked is the impact on cybersecurity insurance. Districts struggle. We struggle mightily to get cyber insurance because we just don't have the resources. And this throws a lifeline to districts to be able to say, the data you have is important, education is important, we've got to protect and secure it. And there could be some financial impact beneficial to a district in the future. As we start to mature, we hopefully will see cybersecurity premiums decrease as in response to the good work that can get done through this funding.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's new enough that the more schools and districts that sign on, potentially the lower those premiums will become. I mean, I'm no insurance expert, but that's my basic understanding of how that system works, is that if more of us jump in, it helps all of us have lower fees. And it was exciting to see. I know that from an advocacy standpoint, you have been involved. I've been involved. A number of organizations, some that you mentioned, a couple others as well, are out there. And we actually made visits to Capitol Hill to bring this concept up. Our initial push was make it part of E-rate, make it part of the longest lasting, largest ed tech funding lever that ever has existed in this country. And this is a good step towards that. It's not exactly that yet, but it's a nice first step towards it. And certainly 200 million isn't going to hit everybody's needs, but it's a great pilot, which is the intent. Let's see if there's a hunger out there for it in the districts, which there is, and let's see how well it goes in terms of rolling it out. So I think it's a reasonable first step, and I'm encouraged by it.
Absolutely.
With the mention of E-rate, I thought I'd throw it out there. It is the longest lasting and the largest funding ed tech program in the country, and it's coming out of the FCC, which is surprising to folks when they find that out. But could you speak to E-rate, especially for folks that may be new to this role, or their district just got past a threshold where it makes sense for E-rate? What would you recommend for those in that situation? And for those like yourself that have been doing this a few years, what would you recommend for E-rate and what to pay attention to?
Yeah, I think E-rate's been such an important part of all of our journeys in terms of trying to provide the best resources and infrastructure we can for students and staff. You know, a lot of times we think of category one and that making sure we have internet service, right? Because that's kind of how it started. And then, and that's great. And it's helped us significantly as we've watched over, you know, I can tell you 9 years ago, our district total bandwidth was 500 megs for 54 schools, 40,000 students, 500 meg internet connection, right?
Wow.
My house has more than that now,
right,
in years. And so, and so it's changed so dramatically, and it's great that we've got internet connectivity supported through E-rate. But when you think about it's not just connectivity, it's all the other things, the switches, the hubs, the infrastructure that makes that all work. And so that category 2 funding is really critical as well. And it's something that, you know, if you are, like you said, new to E-rate, it's something you should really leverage, because there's a lot of space in there for building out your entire network environment, as opposed to just thinking about, okay, we're going to limit it to the internet connectivity.
And you had mentioned earlier that category 2 is particularly valuable. What is that, and what does that cover for those that aren't familiar?
Yeah, so, you know, for us, we're in the middle of a big project right now, which is going to be under E-rate category 2 of replacing 360 network switches at schools. And so that's a tremendous expense. And last year we did 300. This year we're going to do 360, and hopefully we're going to get them all done. But something like that's an enormous cost, and it's hard, you know, to go to the general fund, even though we have to have it, right? You don't have network switches, you don't have network. So, you know, having E-rate support that refresh for us allows us to make sure that we are getting switches that have the capacity, they have the security, they are not end of life in terms of support, and we can leverage E-rate category 2 funding through those.
So, Stephen, you mentioned infrastructure just a moment ago, and it reminds me of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that was passed into law, and it includes $65 billion for broadband. Now, certainly that's for all industries, not just education. But do you know anything about that? Is that something we should keep our eye on in terms of potential future funding for schools and libraries?
Yeah, you know, Oregon has a lot of rural areas where internet access to cities, and not just to mention schools, is a challenge. You know, there's a story of a radio dish that fills with snow, and internet dies for a good school district, and someone's job is to drive up the mountain and sweep the snow in 2023, right? So this is another, I think, going to be a very important funding stream, especially for our districts in rural areas that might not have the infrastructure. You know, a couple of years ago, I think during the pandemic, we were fortunately to be part of the COSIN Digital Equity study. And so we got a detailed analysis of our student usage by school, by home. And what we found is we were an outlier in Beaverton in terms of we had great internet availability for students. Now, that doesn't mean everyone had the right access or adequate access. So we had to address that. There are many, many school systems, especially our rural colleagues, who don't have the availability part. And so this funding, I think, would be something very interesting for them to be able to look at, to say, can we use this to build out our capacity to support our students living in areas that just don't have adequate availability for internet.
And obviously we need to amend the job descriptions to include snow shoveling as other duties as assigned.
Isn't that crazy? Yeah,
that is.
I kind of want that job, actually. It'd be fun to take a truck up there and do that.
Sure. Get away from the computer screen, stretch your legs. Yeah, could be good exercise. So I know, obviously I'm an Apple geek. I'm wearing an Apple shirt. I work at Jamf. We love all our devices with apples on the back. And Jamf is proud to protect and manage those devices and help, 40 million students around the globe do that. I thought I'd ask you a question about security, because once upon a time, we used to say to each other, oh, it's a Mac. We don't need to worry about security. And it wasn't necessarily speaking to the security of the device itself, which was prodigious. It was speaking more to the fact that hackers like attention. They like to go big, right? And so given that Apple had this tiny little market share, that wasn't really a space for them. Well, that's changed. Have you guys taken into account, since you have Apple devices at your district, and adjusted the way that you protect Apple, iPad and MacBook devices?
Yeah. Oh, for the good old days when we could say we had security by obscurity, right? That was awesome. And that was my favorite saying. And those days are gone for all of us. We know it now. There are so many vectors in for bad actors that we don't have the luxury anymore of saying, well, this device is not going to get compromised. And so, yeah, we have had to completely rethink our security processes. And as we are implementing those processes, now it doesn't matter the type of device. We have to figure out, how do we make sure that Mac, Windows, whatever, Linux, whatever, IoT devices, right? One of our biggest customers on our network are non-humans in terms of sensors, right? So we have to protect them. And so, because each one is a way in. So we've now got to rethink security to encompass the entire environment.
The broad spectrum, yeah.
Yep.
Well, I, for one, welcome our robot overlords. You speak of, how you have to protect the non-human users on your network, which I've never heard that phrase outside of science fiction. So thank you for bringing that, along with obscurity, security by obscurity. I'm going to save that one as well. Well, in our final minutes here, I thought I'd just take it back to Jamf. We're thrilled to have you as a customer. Is there anything specific about Jamf that you want to share in terms of how we provide management solutions to Beaverton? Anything that you wanted to speak to on that topic?
Yeah, we've been partners a long time with Jamf, and we have a lot of devices in our network, and they are a mix of everything. But one thing that we've always appreciated is the ease of use to be able to manage those devices, because as our number of devices now are approaching 90,000, and we're a school district of 40,000 students. And it's because we have student devices, staff devices, lab, we have non-human devices. So our environment that becomes very, very large, and we have to be able to manage it. If we can't secure it. So, and we don't have a good user experience. And so we've always appreciated that ability that Jamf gives us to be able to manage devices in a way that's intuitive and highly efficient for our stretched IT staff, and also doesn't get in the way of a wonderful user experience when a student picks up a device to learn.
I love that. And I love that you think of the student as the end user. There's so many folks in even in education that often think that deployment ends at the classroom door. Oh, that's not my responsibility. But clearly you have a perspective that goes into the classroom door and supports those students. Was there anything else you wanted to share before I close this? Did we cover all the things?
I think we did. I think, the one piece of advice I would give all of us maybe is we have so many funding streams available now. We have federal funding that's starting to wrap up. We have title funding. There is E-rate category 1 and 2. This is the infrastructure bill. And it's really important, I think, for us to be looking at those streams of funding, saying, how best can we utilize them so that we're offloading the needs of the general fund? Because there's a way for us there to develop some savings for our school districts in terms of general fund usage.
Sage advice. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate your perspective and your time and your friendship and your support. I wish you the best up in Beaverton, and thank you again for taking the time to share your wisdom with our team.
Thank you.
As we wrap up this webinar, I just thought I'd remind you that this is just the start of a journey. This webinar is here to spark a thought process to give leaders and IT professionals insight into the possibilities with your Apple devices. Of course, we are nothing without our customers, and that is proven every day with the Jamf Nation community. This online forum is home to over 100,000 IT-focused individuals that learn from each other, discuss best practices, and have access to a wealth of resources and third-party tools. We even have a dedicated education hub for those managing Apple devices in the EDU space to connect, share, and grow. Create a free account today to join in the discussion. And we also have our marketplace tools and resources to help make the Jamf platform more useful to our customers, with integrations we showcased early on as part of our Education Partner Solution message with companies like Shobi, Explain Everything, and many, many more, all providing integrations between their solutions and Jamf to make your work both simple and secure that can build out your education solution and potential further support cost savings. Thank you so much for coming today. As we mentioned at the beginning, we're here to answer questions, and hopefully this was useful for you and you can apply it immediately and start finding some of that funding.